Thinking about our road to Damascus, wondering if we have a leadership deficiency? Pause, think about it with intentional thought, and consider where we go from here. Stay tuned and hear the perspectives of our independence panel of Rowena Bethel, Nahaja Black, Dr. Christopher Curry, and Dr. Gilbert Morris as we explore the benefits of strong leadership in building a nation. Join our co-sponsors, Paget Investments, DomDev Enterprises, and our friends at Islandese Realty, D1 Development, and Sammy's Tinkin. Share and post your comments, questions, and concerns, and we will endeavor to address them as we go along. We will be right back.
Something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles.
Welcome to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles. What we think, we become. What we radiate, we attract. And what we attract, and what we imagine, we can achieve. Let's change the narrative 2 for 2. Let's become more mature, intelligent in our discussions, and rise the ships on the wave for everybody. This evening we have a special independence panel as we celebrate our 48th year of independence as a vibrant young nation. And we have Mrs. Rowena Bethel. We have Nahaja Black will be joining us shortly. She just finished her personal show. And we have Dr. Chris Curry and Dr. Gilbert Morris, all very esteemed, highly respected individuals in the 2 for 2. That's our area code of the Bahamas. So we look forward for a very intriguing conversation this evening. Welcome, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Hi.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you and to my colleagues.
Yes.
Great.
Happy
Awesome.
to be here.
That's great. So,
Hello. Me?
sorry, was that somebody say something just now? So, we have Rowena Bethel.
Can you hear me, Dale?
Yes, I can. So Rowena Bethel is a public administrator and specialty. Well, you know, if I try to go through all the old titles, we'll be here till tomorrow. But all of the good stuff is on Facebook. Or the whole bios are there for you all to read and look up on, and so forth. So we welcome you all to this discussion as to the benefits of strong leadership in building a nation. And as we say, we are here at 48 years, and in the Bahamas, we think we have been around for 250 odd years, like some of our neighboring countries. But, you know, we still have a ways to go, and so we want to have a discussion this evening that is going to help us understand some of the principles and some of the key items that drives a nation and us being in strong leadership, how that can have an impact on those areas. And so what we normally know is that sometimes we are a toddler and then we grow up. And as a toddler, we still know right and wrong. The same way we will know from the difference between leadership and management. And so in terms of business and managing people and leading people, we look at the two of those things. Now, all persons will look at things from a different management or leadership model. And so we have those things where we would have grown up through the colonial mechanism, and now we're on to some of more modern technologies and models of governance and leadership and the like. And so we want to touch into all of those this evening in a way. And so as we do that, we want to be able to highlight for you, basically, first and foremost, what is leadership and what is a leader, right? And so for my training, we have maybe a deficiency in the persons in leadership positions, but not necessarily a deficiency in leader, as I see it, because we have a lot of leaders, but they might not be in positions of leadership. But, and then there's a question as to whether the leaders have the vision or have a vision. And in that sense, we also know that everybody has a vision, but that doesn't necessarily mean the people who are following is sharing in that vision. And so those are two key things. So in leadership, the fundamental thing in leadership is to lead, L-E-A-D. And that demands voluntary act. There's no forcing in that. There's no pushing in that. There's no pulling in that. There's no dragging in that. There's no bossing in that. It's no authoritative action in leadership. And this is my training of over many moons, cycled many times. And so we want to touch on how being strong in those areas will be able to help us grow the Bahamas to be where we need to go. And then the other part to it is that we tend to mix up leadership and management. Well, I was taught that people lead people and manage processes, systems, and things, whereas in the Bahamas, sometimes we get it mixed up and we want to manage people and then lead everything else. And so we tend to get that backwards. And so what we want this august body of persons here, and Dr. Morris, Curry, Bethel, and Nahaja Black, when she joins us, to be able to break down some of the areas of their expertise and experiences and help us understand how and why we need to do things differently in the Bahamas than what we are doing it today. So before we break into their direct, I'll just post my definition of a leadership which I gave to the panel so that they could pivot on it, dissect it, chop it up, whatever they want to do with it, and present from their perspective what they would think. So Madam Producer, you want to play that for us?
And with the sustainable capacity and skills of inspiring a group of individuals to voluntarily follow them in striving as a team to achieve a common set of goals, a cause, which they as individuals do not visualize with any stretch of the imagination, and achieving such by themselves. Dale Happy Knowles.
Thank you, Madam Producer. So we will kick off this ball this evening by asking Dr. Curry to give us a historic walk down leadership of our leadership styles over the last 700 odd years, from 1492 up, picking out the strong leaders that he would have considered to be strong leaders, how they had impacts and the like. And so we asked them to compress a whole course that would happen for a whole semester into couple of minutes. So give us a framework as to what we're talking about when we say strong leaders. Dr. Curry.
Right. Well, I appreciate being invited to this panel discussion, and I will try to be as succinct as possible, even though you're asking me to do the impossible and cover what amounts to about 500 years of our history. Let me start by saying probably the best example was when we started with the Lucayans, because their leadership style was somewhat consensus or cooperative in how they created leaders and made decisions. Though the cacique was both religious and political leader, he got his position through who his mother was, through matrilineal descent. But unquestionably, they often made decisions based on consensus. And so they shared food, they shared resources. And I think that kind of communal living is something that we might idealize. I wouldn't suggest returning to it, but at least lifting it up as something to be admired. When the first colonization experiment occurred in the Bahamas in 1648 with the Lutheran adventurers, they adopted an aristocratic Republican model of government. If you learn anything about the Lutheran adventurers in high school, they probably would have told you that it was a Republican model. But if you study their constitution, it was far from a Republican model, because leadership was held in the hands of the first that arrived. And the 100 who were elected to the Senate, basically they elected whoever came in when a vacancy arrived through the death of a senator. And everyone else who arrived after that 100 had no access to power or leadership. So that seemed more authoritarian, and certainly not consensus building at all. As you move through the early colonial period of our country, you see that model being reinforced with very bad consequences. During the preparatory period, again, you have a hierarchical system in place where power is confided or in a small group of 6 Lord Proprietors, and they are appointing governors who basically do their will. They made some very bad choices for governors, and many of the governors were very corrupt. Many of them, in fact, fell into the hands of pirates, being influenced by pirates, or even allowing pirates basically to run the show. So this was a really negative period as it relates to leadership, because you could argue there really wasn't any leadership at that time. Really visionaries, unless you are lauding the life of the pirate. And there have been some who've tried to rehabilitate the character of the pirate by suggesting they were the first real democracy. And it is true that, outside of the captain and the first mate or quartermaster, most of the loot that was taken by pirates was shared equally. And there was also a sense that there was a raceless society. You had black and red and white pirates all working together. But the truth of the matter is the pirates were sea robbers. And when they came upon land, they vented or let out all of that steam and just absolutely carried on in a very lawless manner in taverns and brothels and the like. But fast forwarding to a period, I guess we would suggest that was the period where we had the most law and order established was probably during the Loyalist period, because they brought a rigid social and racial hierarchy to the Bahamas. And you did see some kind of leadership emerging that I would suggest was effective. But at the same time, it was following a colonial model of leadership, which is extremely hierarchical and authoritarian, and most of the power was vested in the governor and his executive council. And I would say, as you broaden this to the 20th century, you find most of that kind of model of governance, particularly in the Anglophone Caribbean, remain, where power was vested in a small group of men. In the Caribbean, we would have called them the plantocracy, but in the Bahamas, with the absence of a real export crop, and without plantations really operating very effectively, we refer to them as the agro-commercial oligarchy. And I want you to know they were a group of white merchants who controlled the social, political, and economic spheres of Bahamian society. They didn't rule as one individual. They ruled as a cohort or a group of like-minded persons who had their own special interests at heart. So this is an interesting leadership model because it's like the boardroom, right? And the idea is you protect your own interests while excluding everyone else. And that's essentially what the Bay Street Boys did. Now, understand this. In truth, we didn't actually have political parties until 1953. And so the need for a singular leader was not really present in the Bahamas because you had a group that thought and acted and behaved the same way. But when the PLP is formed in 1953, there is now a need for a discernible leader and a leadership style that would gravitate to the people at that time. And so before I quickly move to looking at the period of party politics in the Bahamas, I just want to quickly mention what was happening in the Caribbean in that time. Because what was happening was this was the age of the populist leader, where men, and I stress men, often came to power by making grandiose statements, by promising much but delivering little. And in the Caribbean, also the populist leader, and I would include Latin America as well, the populist leader's profile often was one of authoritarian leadership. All right, he was known for being a macho man, for being strong and powerful and having charisma. And he was great at connecting with people at rallies or any place in the public sphere where you would have a large audience where you could speak to. And the rhetoric was so important to try and convince people that you were about change or that you were for them. One of the greatest examples of a populist leader in the region, I can give a couple, but one that strikes me as important is Rafael Trujillo. And he was the authoritarian dictator of the Dominican Republic in the 1930s. And he had a lot of support with the peasants. He promised them land. He promised to kick out many of the foreigners and to allow them to have free access to tools, land grants, etc. But while he did follow through with some of those promises, it's interesting that he went about a campaign of whitening the Dominican Republic. And how did he do that? By getting rid of the black population in the DR, mostly of Haitian descent or Haitian origins. In 1937, in fact, there was a Blood River massacre where over 10,000 Haitians were massacred in an attempt on the part of Trujillo to whiten the DR. All right, so that's just an example of a man who has a conflicted personality. On the one hand, seemingly popular, but at the same time very despotic. Well, that kind of profile you see in another example, and we could go right next door in the territory in Hispaniola known as Haiti, because in 1957, Francois Duvalier came to power, and again, he rode on a wave of populist rhetoric, known as a doctor, not just a medical doctor, but rumor had it that he was a high priest of voodoo, and he could fix you real good. But anyways, him and his son, who came to power around 1971 upon his death, they ruled Haiti with an iron fist from 1957 to 1985. All right, and they took in almost all of the treasury that Haiti had as a poor country was used to pave the one good road from the airport to their palatial palace. And while most of the Haitians suffered tremendously under their rule, it was well known that Papa Doc Duvalier particularly was very ruthless, creating his own private armed forces, the Tom Tom Maku, and then his son, being more of a playboy, spent most of the country's money on fine wine, Dom Perignon, and caviar, of course, having connections with France. And so they ran the country to the ground. And that is the kind of populist leader that a lot of Caribbean countries, unfortunately, suffered under. Now, getting back to the Bahamas, as I try to conclude in the next 5 minutes, because I know I only have about 20 minutes of time, I've probably taken about 10 or 15 already. The last 5 minutes or so, I want to reflect on what we got. We rode on the curtails, of leadership that was borrowing much on the Latin American Caribbean model, the populist leader. But there was also a progressive element to the early PLP's agenda. They actually had gone to England and studied the Fabian Society. They were a labor group. They'd gone to Jamaica, they'd gone to Ghana and studied some of the freedom fighters and the rhetoric and ideology that they espoused. And they tried to graft and apply it to much of what was going on in the Bahamas in the 1950s. So they had a progressive agenda, and they realized very quickly that being light-skinned, I'm talking about William Cartwright and H.M. Taylor, and of course, Cyril Stevenson, they realized they needed to have a figure that could resonate with the black masses without losing touch with the middle class and elites who were much more educated. And so there was by 1958 a power struggle within the PLP for a leadership position, as H.M. Taylor and the older founders realized that they had to pass the baton on to a new and younger generation, a younger leader. The choice was between Randall Fox and Pinling. And Randall Fox apparently was too progressive and maybe too radical and militant in his language and the way he delivered his speeches. He certainly gravitated towards the masses, and laborers certainly saw him as a leader, particularly in the 58 strike. But Pinling was a pragmatist, and they liked the pragmatism of Pinling more than they liked the radicalness of Fox. So Pinling becomes both the leader in the House, and eventually by 1964, he's going to be the leader of the PLP as a whole. And between 62 and 64, H.M. Taylor, I almost said Michael Stevenson, Cyril Stevenson, and William Cartwright are kind of pushed to the side, and it becomes Pinling's party. As much as Pinling was a pragmatist, he was also a consensus builder in the early period from 63 to 68. I would argue Pinling was at his best as a leader. The reason I say that, if you talk to people like Arthur Folks, if you talk to Adie Hanna, if you talk to people who were in the fight, Eugene Nuri, who is still alive, they will tell you that he was a consensus builder. When they had meetings, whether it be convention or otherwise, he would always ask for people's opinions, and he would build a consensus on a particular point or policy, and then he would go out and publicly support it. And I think that, Dale, is kind of what you were alluding to in your definition. But here's the thing. The major reason, I would argue, why the Dissident 8 happened, that eventually became the Free PLP, which eventually merged with the UBP to form the FNM, wasn't over ideology. It was over management style and leadership posturing. And after the 68 landslide election victory, Pinling, apparently, this is the allegations made by Cecil Wallace Whitfield, Warren Lavarity, and others, they're saying that Pinling increasingly moved away from a consensus building style and started to make decisions on his own, started to make decisions which his cabinet were not always privy to. And he would then come and tell them of the decision he made after he had made it, rather than consulting them. So that was the major beef that led to the split. And it speaks to a differing management or leadership style. And unfortunately, I think as we look at our country's history in the more recent past, we have too much of the latter and not too much of the former, meaning we have too much leaders who rely on their own personality and their own charisma, and not enough on the consensus that could be built by listening to others and offering their suggestions and building consensus, right? And so one of the, just to end on this point, if you look at another example of a split in the 70s, you had the FNM fragment into the SDP and the BDP by 1977, and the FNM could not hold themselves together. And part of it was the rhetoric of Cecil, who apparently was more confrontational and charismatic, maybe along the lines of Randall Fox at an earlier point. And then you had the peacemaker and the peacekeeper and Kendall Isaacs. And it turns out it was Kendall Isaacs who ended up being the healing balm of the FNM in Gilead by 1982, bringing the party back together, but not lasting long enough, as of course he got sick and passed away untimely. So the point I'm making, though, is where you have consensus building leadership, you'll find that a party can thrive and do well. But too often we revert to I guess, the Caribbean model that I laid out: the populist rhetoric, the populist leader, the authoritarian leader, the guy who is like a one-man band, and he basically tells his cabinet what to do, and they have to basically cling to that because they know they got their cabinet position solely because of the authority that was vested in him. So I think as I end, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that what we have even now in 2021 is kind of that style of leadership overtaking the model that I think works better for our country, which is the consensus building model that I think is embedded in your definition.
Yes. So thank you, Brother Curry. Very thought-provoking. One of the things that you mentioned in there was, well, besides the fact that all of the leaders except for one, or maybe two that you talked about were authoritative and not necessarily would not have been somebody who would subscribe to the definition that I put up, right? And so forth. And so as it being a voluntary act to follow by the mere nature of the word lead. But so you said something key there in terms of passing the baton, succession.
Yeah.
And the leadership of the original PLP saw that as a need, and they had that choice, and then they went about it and decided. Now, I don't know how the decision was made to go with Pinland versus the Sarandon. Just those three made that decision, or when others, they engaged in it, and so forth. And then the other thing was, before I introduce Nahaja Black, would be the Sir Clemente Maynard. I think it was him who said to us, either under the tree or on radio or something somewhere, I can't remember. It was him, and my mom was also very friendly. Said something to the fact that Pinland, since you mentioned him, was very brilliant in repackaging your ideas. And so when you talk about getting all that consensus information, and by the time as he got it and then he put it back on the table, you would have thought it was, as Sir Clem, I think, said, you would have thought it was his idea from the break, that it's something totally great. I asked that to say, you mentioned these persons up to Pinland. Has there been anybody since, and not necessarily just in the political arena, but in any leadership sphere in the Bahamas, who might have these attributes that people could look at and say, these are persons who we would want to emulate versus just because, some people touch us about the Pinland FNM PLP to do.
Yeah, before I answer that question real quick, I thought of the example of Bahamianization is a great one to support your point. That was an idea that A.D. Hanna came up with, but Pinland really rode that as a major policy point in the early 1970s. And even the idea of independence, people will tell you, was A.D. Hanna's idea. If not A.D. Hanna, I know that Randall Fox even had suggested that around 66, 67. So Pinland wasn't the originator of the idea of moving towards independence, but he certainly took the reins and ran with it once it was articulated by his party. So that's an example of a leader who is listening to the advice of others and benefiting from it. But to answer your question, the one person I think of that really inspired me as a leader was the late Dr. Rowena Bethel. And the reason I have to think about her is early in my career, I came in to COB full-time in 2003, and she was sort of installed at that point, already past her presidency. She was the president of UB or COB at the time, but when I came in, Dr. Leon Hicks had already taken over. She wasn't quite retired. She was still at the college, but what really impressed me was whenever I ran into her, she was an encourager. She was always able to know your name, to say something about you, and identify your talent and your skill set, and find a way to make you feel good about yourself, and find a way to see where you could improve yourself and work in your area of giftedness. And so Dr. Rowena Bethel reminds me of the kind of leader that I think we lack in this country. Leadership isn't about being on top of things and being the person in charge. Leadership is about making other people greater than they see in themselves.
Right. Awesome. So we're getting some background music there, which set the tone, I guess. And so we would like to welcome Nahaja Black to something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles. It's been, I guess, a long day for you, and we welcome you, and hopefully you were able to pick up on what we were talking about. This, I know, Dr. Morris will always be sharp with that. Because he's going to be able to roll, and we lost him earlier, and so he's now back also, and so we welcome you both back.
Thank you.
So, yes. So, any questions for those who were able to pick on Dr. Curry's presentation, and any comments that you might have in relation that you want to either challenge or support? Rowena?
Yeah. Dale. Yeah, very, very interesting history, Chris. I thoroughly like that. Probably stayed in the Bahamas up to about 10 years age, and then I was shuttled off to boarding school in England to refine me. My mother left the Bahamas several years of that, emigrated to the States. So I did not go through the whole process here, and that was quite interesting. But a little bit of history for you. William Cartwright was my stepfather. He was my mother's second husband. And it was interesting listening to his side of what took place and also listening to your rendition. But one of the things Dale invited me to speak that I was fairly consumed with was, how do you build a nation? That is how I look at political leadership. How do you move a nation forward? And as you presented the sort of overview of leadership only in the Bahamas, within this region, I kind of got the sense that there was a lot more party political drive, as opposed to focusing on how my position can be used to improve the greater good. Although I realize that within the context of Bahamian history, we did go through that stage with independence and the introduction of some of the sort of pillars of nation building, not long enough. And from a vantage point, what I tended to see is in terms of leadership in the Bahamas, it's more about who controls one party versus the other. And that carries over even to when they may be in government, as opposed to, which is, I am no longer the head of party. I now lead a nation, and every person in this nation is a child of mine, and I am as beholden to person X as I am to person, whatever they are, whatever their situation may be, whatever their political leanings may be. I am beholden to these people. And I wondered whether you could explain, well, one, whether you agree with me, because that in the sense very strong. I returned to the Bahamas in 1982 when I finished law school, the only one of my mother's children that decided to come back. And I sensed during that time this a sort of what I see happening a lot, or has happened a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, where the maximum leader comes along and he's strong and he takes on everybody, but he's fighting about party politics as opposed to moving the nation forward. Yes, certain things are done that is painted in the umbrella of moving the nation forward and improving the general lot of people. But when you actually kind of analyze that and go a little bit deeper, what it is, it boils down, in my view, to rewarding those who have supported me. So I see basically leadership in this country has been an issue of, team sports, team politics.
Yeah.
I know that's kind of harsh, but anybody else?
No, I think that's an astute observation. I think that the problem with party politics is that you have people who just want to hold on to power, and so they're not interested in being visionaries and passing laws or doing things that might be unpopular, but actually might be for the better, or as you put, the common good of the people. And so there's a sort of knee-jerk reaction where a lot of times our politicians are just trying to maintain power rather than doing things that are proactive and are visionary and have long-term consequences, right? So they're just trying to survive in the fishbowl of party politics. And unfortunately, it means that they're often reacting to things, and they're only doing things as a band-aid approach to a bigger problem. And they're only thinking about the present, and they're not looking down the road at the future, and they're not thinking about enacting a national development plan, because all of the kind of things that they should be doing aren't going to help them in the present with party politics and where we flip-flop since 1997. All of that doesn't help the cause. So you're absolutely right that we've been sort of in an unfortunate rat race and hamster wheel, so to speak, where we're spinning our wheels and our leaders aren't really being visionary because of the party politics scenario.
Awesome. Nahaja, you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't speak when smart people are speaking. I politely sit in my corner and absorb. So I will gladly wait my turn and not interject when enough has been said. So that was wonderful contributions by both.
You're funny.
You're too funny.
She sounds like a leader. She sounds like the leader of a political party.
Rowena, it's so good to see you. But hopefully it's a leader of a political party that makes sense one day.
I put in my cowrie shell for you. This is my ode to Africa.
I see it. You look fabulous, darling. You look fabulous.
Yeah. So
thank you, darling.
So, Doc, the idea of succession in that period of time then, or when we talk about the strong leader, because I grew up in an era where the strongest leaders were women, and they were the mothers and the women of the community. And so, but I was eager to hear if you were going to call any women's names when you were giving your recital. Or whatever you call it.
Well, that's why when you asked me that question, about examples, I went to Rowena Bethel because she reminded me of the kind of leader that we need, someone who isn't about power or holding on to power for themselves, and who's not interested in their own agenda, but they're empowering other people. And they make other people feel important, and in so doing, they're able to galvanize more people behind their particular cause. Dr. Rowena Bethel, I believe, was in fact the longest, I got to talk to Nicolette about this, the longest tenured president and the first president of COB. And so that speaks volumes to her. I think she's a legend, and she's of course long gone, but she's not forgotten. But if you want to press the button a little further about women in leadership, one could easily go back to the 1950s and 60s and the suffragette movement. Individuals like Doris Johnson, certainly, and Mabel Walker comes to mind. She was not a Bahamian. She married into the Bahamas through C.R. Walker, but she was a formidable force, and she was the first president of the Bahamas Union of Teachers. So she strikes me as an amazing woman. Of course, we have a union house and a school named after her. Even Mary Ingram, the first president of the women's suffrage movement, demonstrated the kind of leadership that I think we lack. And interestingly, she was the first president, but when Doris came back with her PhD from the University of Toronto, Mary stepped aside and she saw in Doris something that she didn't have. She saw that Doris would be a better public speaker, would be the spokesperson for the movement in a way that she couldn't. And so again, to me, that typifies the kind of leader that we have so few of, the selfless person who is more interested in getting the policy or the movement advanced than their own self-aggrandizement.
Right, awesome. Well, we thank you for what you said so far. Actually, we're going to come back to a lot of that. Go ahead, Rowena.
I had another observation that I wanted to make in relation to this issue of leadership in the Bahamas in particular. And I kind of look at it, and we want, and as Chris spoke, actually, it came back to my mind, we want a Moses, we want a savior. And I think that was a natural reaction to come out of the era of slavery. We needed somebody who could handle the white guys, as it were, take them on, speak at their level, and basically let them know I can think as, I'm just as educated as you are, so I can handle all of these philosophical discussions. As time progresses, and I'll contrast this with perhaps those countries that do well on the well-being and happiness indices every year, the Nordic countries and New Zealand, for example. But the leaders tend to, what I have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, the leaders cobble together, or maybe deliberate, maybe cobble is not a nice word, or not a nice phrase. They put together a team of people. And I get the sense that half of them they don't trust, but it's on the basis that you keep your friends close, but you keep your enemies even closer. And consequently, there's this struggle that goes on within the leadership arena, because it's only the leader is, we look at that as the one person, but it's impossible for one person to make to create the environment and to make the changes that are needed. That person needs a team, and that team needs a machinery. And I would have shared this with Dale earlier. In my opinion, there's been weaknesses in that team, and the weaknesses that I've seen have come from fundamentally a lack of trust in relation to a number of them within the team, but you don't let them out, you just keep them close. Or you do away with any resistance, and you put people who are just too afraid to open their mouths and challenge what the leader says. And then you have the executing machinery or the implement machinery. And for us, I look at public administration, public service, and to me, that is inordinately decayed, outdated, and weak. It's a relic from, in my opinion, it's a relic from our colonial days. It hasn't changed a great deal. If there's been superficial changes, certainly a lot of the mindset remains as it was in those days. And as a result, I think it's going to take an extraordinarily strong one person as leader to make the changes that are necessary to properly set the country on the course for nation building. He must also be prepared to get cut down, not only from within his ranks, but obviously also from perhaps within the machinery as well. But I think that has to do also with whether or not our leaders are completely committed to moving the country forward, or they're committed moving their party's interest forward. I believe by and large, it's really moving the party's interest forward as opposed to the country. Certainly that's been my observation.
Great. So you've segued us very well into the subject or the topic that I gave assigned to you to present, which is the sustainable democratic policy, the leadership engine of success. Or is that the democratic policy, the leadership engine of success? And so you mentioned a few things just now that I think is going to be very critical in the long run. But one of the things is that our structure and our environment in which we will operate, will that needs to be conducive for us to have proper leadership and proper performance within the system throughout all levels. And leadership, as I was taught, is not reserved for a person who sits in a hierarchy or in at the apex of any organization. Leadership happens throughout the organization from the janitor straight up. It's an action. And so if you would now share with us your thoughts on the sustainable democratic policy for the leadership engine for success. How do you see, with your background in public administration and the like, how does that machinery change? But you talk about the civil service and the rest is antiquated. My mouth getting tired. I'll keep quiet and listen.
Outdated.
Yeah, outdated, yes.
Yeah. I guess most of my thoughts and ideas were formed during the 10-year period that I was a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts in Public Administration. Prior to that, I did not properly understand the impact, the machinery that political leaders rely on to execute their policies, how fundamentally important that was in success and in nation building. I think that what we saw happening after the Millennium Development Goals were completed was a recognition. Millennium Development Goals were basically these sort of threshold targets that were set to, in fact, lift populations around the world out of poverty, targeted in developing countries. But I think what came out of that was the need to introduce some streamlined coherence in policies. And I don't know that that message has quite got across. So you got focus on things like a whole of government approach, and being able to recognize all of the cross-cutting issues so that at the end of the day, when a policy is implemented, it's not done in a fragmented way, and it doesn't miss important connectors or relationships that exist. For example, I know that Tony Blair had set as one of his main policies ending poverty. Included in ending poverty with things like dealing with health issues, dealing with housing issues, dealing with educational issues, dealing with full employment, issues like that. So it was important to ensure basically that at the highest level that there was a focus on, singular policy, although these may involve separate agencies. Now, when you get to the issue of separate agencies, it's important to be able to find a mechanism to get them to work collaboratively and to coordinate their activities. What I have found is that many good ideas and many policy ideas fail because the connecting or the relationship agencies were never involved in the discussion, in the design, in the implementation. And consequently, you have an outcome that falls short of its target, and everybody's confused and scratching their heads because, it was just such a brilliant idea. But the idea cannot work because people's lives don't work in silos. So to me, that is one way that we have to address this issue of how do you kind of go about implementing policies that have impacts. What it also requires is a level of coordination and consensus. Chris mentioned this before, at cabinet level. My experience, and I'm speaking from experience, is that there isn't often a great deal of consensus. Well, there may be consensus at cabinet, but once the meeting is over or wherever the decisions are taken, everybody goes back to their separate ministries and they all embark on different journeys in different directions, when in fact what's needed is for several of them to come together. Now, a lot of this comes about because of ego. And ministers like to be able to say, I did this and I did this. And a classic example was how we started off e-government. Every minister wanted to have his own website. Every minister wanted to do his own thing. At the end of the day, what you had was chaos. What you really needed was a website that dealt with my issue related to, for example, pregnancy. That meant I needed to understand what my medical benefits may be. I need to understand what my maternity leave entitlements are. All of that is coordinated, and all of that should be sort of in one place, as opposed to me going to the Ministry of Labor's website and then trotting off the National Insurance Board's website. We need to draw all of that together. In the absence of that, we end up, to me, spinning wheels and wasting time. Another contributing factor from my point of view, is this upheaval that one goes through. There ought to be a degree of continuity within the service, because policies really ought to be developed with long-term goals and with long-term objectives in mind. what has happened since we started our one-term stint is that each incoming administration wipes the slate clean, pretty much, chops things off in midstream, introduces a whole new group of people. I'm not entirely sure how much transition activity takes place, but that is disruptive. You have people that come in that may not have had the benefit of understanding what the history was behind why it worked the way it worked, why it didn't work the way it worked. And therefore, we're unable to really show any progress. And what then happens is when we find ourselves in situations of reviews, we are literally sitting there in front of potential multilateral bodies, for example, explaining a situation as if it started 2 weeks ago, when it may have had a history going back 10 years. So to me, what is important in sustainability is we've got to build the machinery that we rely on. And again, that is public administration. Now, that's not so easy, I think, in our context, because the sort of, I guess, the education that many countries would have gone through to get to the point where they are, the issues of openness, the issues of engaging the public in deciding basically how you resolve problems that impact the public, we have not gone through to the extent that you see elsewhere. As a result, we still to this day will go and implement something. There is a massive backlash from the public, and then we have to turn around and shift gears. That is not conducive, and it's not constructive. It's costly. It is just disruptive within the system itself, because you don't know to what extent procedures may have been implemented, budgets may have been expended in implementing something that really is counterproductive. So from my perspective, I believe that if, in fact, we have leaders, political leaders, who are truly interested in moving the nation forward, then we have to begin to look at the machinery that they are going to rely on, and a machinery that's going to essentially ensure that the people that you serve have a voice before as much as possible, because there are going to be cases where the emergencies, but before these plans are implemented, let people feed into the plans, let people explain the situation as they see it, let them understand the impacts. I remember several years ago, I attended a UN meeting in Bolivia, and we were talking about basically these initiatives that were tackling social issues in communities. And I was asked to speak about the Urban Renewal Project at the time. And I got some materials. And what was impressive to the attendees and the UN was the fact that many of these urban renewal centers were in areas where fathers were largely absent. The police officers were filling father roles. And I remember talking to some of the police officers who said that if the child didn't go to school, they themselves went to the home and they spoke to the children, particularly the young boys. But to me, the UN was very impressed that the Bahamas, we actually had, I don't know whether it was by design or whether we stumbled upon it, but we actually were able to fill a void. In that as well were these bands that they had put together. And as trivial as that may seem to somebody, if you can find something that can occupy young boys, that can keep them focused, that can keep them interested in positive activity, go for it. But when I was told that the police officers, the male police officers in particular, were in these centers that acted as after-school homework centers, and that were there, teachers were having issues with the boys, could go to the school and talk to the teachers and then come home and talk to the young boys. That was impactful. I don't know where the Urban Renewal Program is today, but certainly if that has continued, that is important, because that gets to me to the very heart of how we begin to correct some of the social ills that have resulted in the unfortunate circumstance that many of our young men end up in. But again, that was an holistic approach, because I understood that within the urban renewal centers, there were representatives from social service, the police. Some people were not in favor of the police in charge, but I think in our context, maybe it worked because the police represented an authority figure that many of our young boys did not otherwise have. So it's something that I thought was very good. Again, it was done at the community community level, at the very basic level, and it was able to help mold these young people as they were coming up. There was somebody who was interested in them. There was somebody who was there to listen to them. Mommy may have been at work, she couldn't be with them, but at the community center, they had a sense of normalcy to some degree, and adults that showed an interest in their development. It's tackling problems in that way that I think is extremely important. Now, how this is done elsewhere was basically most governments would, and you will find this particularly in the advanced countries, they sat down and their approach was to look at how do you tackle all of these issues. Again, how do you tackle the economic issues? How do you tackle the social issues? How do you tackle the environmental issues? What are the outcomes of all of not tackling these issues? And how do you begin to work with it? So we have to start by recognizing that the delivery mechanism is not working. The siloed approach in government is not working. So we have to find ways to get government agencies to work in teams focused on, in thematic areas to actually address these issues. And you have that straight up the line in government. Ruth Miller actually had something similar to this years ago when the government was introducing anchor projects. She had teams of representatives. Actually, it was the PSs of the various ministries that met, and straight down the line, each PS would then assign officers and their agents to work in ministerial teams in order to address the issues, so that had a coherent approach to resolving issues, and they moved up the line. And then right at the top, at the cabinet level, obviously you could have cabinet subcommittees involved, so that at that point when they had to deal with the policy issues, they would have been fed appropriately from their technocrats and their administrators as to what's happening. And then you had an outcome that was holistic, that everybody understood, everybody could buy into. But my understanding is that that's not always achievable because of the territoriality that exists even at cabinet level. Yeah. So for me, I know that the question is how we deal with sustainability in democracy. I don't like sort of veering too much into the discussion on democracy, because I'm a little bit concerned about getting into theory without looking at how in practice things are supposed to work on the ground, things that are real, things that are going to touch the lives of little children as they come up, so that they are model citizens later on down the line, and things that are going to get leaders sensitized to what is happening in all the corners of this country that can move the country forward. I mentioned earlier the issue of well-being and happiness. And these are indices that several of them that operate around the globe. And the happiest countries always tend to be the Nordic countries, always tend to be the New Zealands of this world. And the reason for that is that they have very open systems. Openness is another important factor. I believe that we have struggled with openness in the Bahamas because so much of our economic success hinged on secrecy for such a long time. And also secrecy was for a long while synonymous with power. If you kept everything to yourself, particularly within the service, then it meant that you were powerful. You knew more than everybody else, and only you could give the answer to something. But when you look at the level of openness, I think what it does is that it creates opportunities to get the citizenry involved in helping to solve problems, solve issues. When everything is a mystery and you're simply being fed an edict, it doesn't help for, I think, many citizens who sit back and think, well, that's a stupid idea because they missed out this, they missed out that, they missed out the net, but that can't work in practice because they didn't think about this or they didn't think about that. And we see a lot of that happening. You see less of that in sort of more advanced countries because the time is taken, and one town hall meeting per event is not sufficient. Town hall meetings, work within a certain context, but we've got to find the means by which there is a constant and open ability for the citizens to engage and give their things. We are thinking about setting up a Disney cruise port on the end of your island, just pull something out of the air. What are your views on this? Citizens say, oh, we're a bit concerned about this, we're concerned about that. You then, as the technocrats and the public servants, you can think about that, and together you all can work on a solution because you are in a position then to share with them what you see the benefits are. And if the issues they have, you may be able to find workarounds, but you do it with the people. You do not, I mean, to me, the worst way to try and foist policy forward is to say, you take it or you leave it, because you get massive reactions. Additionally, I think now in our country, we have sufficient of our people who are well educated. We fully understand what all these concepts are. We have been involved with this many, many times. A lot of our younger ones are offered go off school fairly early. Other than that, we're all of us have the ability to engage even outside. I'm working on a project with the UN at the moment, and I was able to go, to the Australian website and actually sign up for all the services. This is the level of openness that we have to be looking at, but we have to do it with people who we intend to impact. Okay, and to me, unless we are prepared to look at our citizenry as real partners in building and moving forward, we're constantly going to have this tug of war at the party level, and then this tug of war with the general citizenry moving forward. And at the end of the day, even those who think they're benefiting in the end may not be able to benefit.
Awesome stuff. So when we look at what you just said in a big way,
it's an awful lot, but
yes. So you mentioned at the beginning the connecting of agency, the coordinating, the consensus, the continuation for long-term objectives and the like, and so forth. And so when we look at that whole picture, and we have a real current example in our independence celebration of the ceremony of apex for our country, of the flag raising and everything, and the Bahamian artists complaining that nobody consulted with them. So you're suggesting, from what I'm taking, is that you can use policy to structurally cause those three things to happen: the connection of agency, the coordination, the consensus and stuff. Policy can be structured in such a way to cause those things to automatically happen in such a way. Is that what I'm hearing you to say as a nutshell?
Absolutely. And that's done elsewhere. Basically, governments determined that they wanted, and we've mentioned it, I've heard them talk about it. We're great with buzzwords. We absolutely love words du jour. But what we need to do is to make that a reality in practice. So the government decides that it's going to look at ways of restructuring how decision-making happens in government, okay? And it requires those agencies that should be involved to work together so that the outcome is holistic and the outcome actually does address the mischief or the policy that they wanted to tackle. So they can make that decision. Now, having said that, although, as I said, I've heard it a lot, I can say to you in even, in recent discussions that there is a tension to a certain degree between a lot of the ministries. There's a peculiar, and there has been for a long time, I noticed this when I was in government, there's a peculiar level of competition between ministers that make absolutely no sense whatsoever to me, because at the end of the day, even if this minister does something in his ministry and another minister fails, as far as Bahamians is concerned, the whole government ain't no good.
Yeah.
So I would have thought logic would say we all work together to produce a particular outcome. At the end of the day, it's a decision of government. It is not one ministry versus another ministry. And my experience is not sufficient of that has happened in government. And I see that still has not been added, certainly not to the levels of your OECD countries or your Nordic countries or your New Zealand countries, where your gauge in relation to all of this is how satisfied are your citizens with government. I'm not talking about how satisfied am I with my party. I'm talking about, is my life better? Do my children have prospects? Am I able to send my children to decent school? Will my lights stay on? Okay, do I have decent water? All of those things we still have to address in an holistic way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So is that happening because we don't have diversity of generations in our system of leadership, in our positions of leadership? It's all, I don't want to say senior, but what's the word I'm looking for? Dr. Curry, I know you got all the words in your dictionary. There's very little young people.
Veterans is the word you're looking for.
Yes, we only have those, and so they all come from. I mean, generations have their overall thought process, their mindset, and so is it because everybody who are dominating in the leadership positions are all in a certain set, and we don't have the diversity? Do those other countries have a diversity in their systems?
Well, New Zealand has a woman, can I say, first of all?
Yeah, well, not just the woman, but I mean in terms of the age differences. Yeah.
The problem we have is one that's referred to as horizontalization. And that is that generation after generation, because of what Ms. Bethel said, we have a party imperative. You have the same people in every political cycle are at the trough, the same set of people over and over again. And so there's no room for young people to grow. If you look at other countries, your prime ministers, your senior civil servants, your senior, even members of the police force, they pass on to become members of the board of trustees of research institutes and review bodies and things like that improve civil society and improve governance. And these things are important for small countries. Can you imagine if you had ombudsmen who were retired judges, retired police commissioners, retired prime ministers, and so on, who were there outside of government but within civil society, sitting on boards and offering independent reports on the governance and functions of boards? This is what Bermuda has done by creating the Institute of Directors, where even small businesses are required for that. We suffer from a horizontalization. And so in sociological terms, there's no intergenerational transfer of power, authority, and status. And so everyone finds himself bunched up against generation after generation, bunched up against the line. And you'll see, even when the parties change, the same old retreads are sort of rewound into the system. And so there's no place for ideas and innovation to rise up through the system. And even when you have a situation like that, Bermuda has something, Cayman has something, Dubai has something, New Zealand has something, Singapore has something they call a sandbox. And a sandbox is a policy that is, or a set of principles or concepts that's not yet policy. And what they do is they take people like the people gathered on this in this interview, my colleagues, and they say, look, here is an idea. We don't know what to do with it, but hash it out amongst yourselves and then come back to us, right? With a set of ideas. And this is not a one-off thing. It's happening over and over again. If you teach in Washington, D.C., the Defense Intelligence Agency comes to find you. They say, hey, we have an issue we want to look at. You know, is China going to outpace the United States? And they invite 100 scholars in. They give you lunch and 10 grand, and then you hash it out for the day. They record that, analyze that, and so on, break it down and generate policy. People who have the leading ideas get called back and so on. This happens on a daily, not on a one-off thing, on a daily basis. It doesn't need a crisis to occur. And we don't have that kind of dynamism in our government. And so it's very, very difficult for new ideas to penetrate.
Yes, thank you, Doc. I think that touched a lot of what I was saying. So, Dr. Curry and Madam Black, any comments you want to add to the commentary just now from Ms. Bethel and what Doc brought to the table, Morris?
I figure I better say something or they'll be questioning why I'm here. So I better just add something as fluff. But I will say that, you know, of course, for me, honestly, as I'm sitting here listening to the discourse, I'm always floored with the fact that we have to have these conversations, but there's very little mobilization to the level at which we speak, right? So I'm always curious as to, not curious, but I'm always stunned, flabbergasted that we can have these types of conversations with Dr. Bethel, Dr. Gilbert. I figure I should say Dr. Curry, Dr. Gilbert, and I should say Dr. Bethel as well, that we're having this level of discourse here, Dale. And I wonder if this level of discourse, I mean, what do? They stop us at the ground floor in Parliament? Like, what happens when, so when we talk about the sustainability of it, I do believe that the effort must come just with the initial discussion on who we elect. I think all of this is great energy used, but when it's not actually implemented, I find for me that I get easily frustrated and I ask the questions, what is the point? Mm-hmm. What is the point of all of this intelligent discourse if it's just intelligent discourse amongst five in the general public? But are we expecting this level of discourse? Are we expecting this level of, not just intellectual back and forth, but the implementation of just basic principles and policy, basic understandings of that, as Rowena said, that policies and the plans touch the young men and women that we're seeking for it to touch. And so for me, I love the discussion, but most times I listen because I find that I feel like we're on this little merry-go-round of smart people. Like we have so many smart people, but they seem not to somehow end up anywhere where they're useful other than in university. No offense, Doc. Either docs.
You know that these things will build on each other, and when momentum picks up, then things start to happen. And so momentum can't pick up that any as an engineer, I'll tell you that there's no great design or no great invention or no great execution of anything that ever happened that didn't start with a thought. And thought,
you're right on that one.
Right? So, I mean, I hear you, I understand what you're saying, and that's really good. And my hope is for these discussions and the like, not just to be one-off.
Please forgive me. I have a talk show. You know, I tell you guys to get paid for this. I'm just tired of talking. That's just.
I'm saying, I know what you're saying. I'm not knocking you for what you're saying.
No, and I'm not knocking this. I support this. That's why I'm here. I want to be here, but I'm not smart enough for this conversation. I keep telling you. I don't know what you brought me here for, Dale.
Well, you'll be surprised to know, because I mean, engineers have to
You're the
design
right
things.
person. You're the right person.
Can I tell you?
Everybody in the Bahamas has a contribution.
Yes.
Go ahead, Morris.
No, perhaps Dr. Curry will speak first, and then I'll follow him.
Oh, I didn't. The only thing I wanted to add was, the fundamental problem we have in leadership is it boils down to a failure of communication. We have a deficit in communication.
Yes.
You were talking about Ms. Bethel, how people operate in silos and how we need to take a holistic approach. But what I see at a basic level, I'll just give it a simple example. Cabinet ministers have at their fingertips PSs, permanent secretaries with a vast amount of experience and knowledge, and yet so few of them tap into that resource. And so few of them actually recognize that they could get the information they're presenting in Parliament, whether it be a bill or something else that they're debating, from their own PSs. But that's just a failure to prepare and a failure to communicate at some level. And we see this across the board in the Bahamas, is that our government is not fully prepared to communicate with each other. And so at different levels, you see failure. And so this idea of working in silos happens. And so rather than dismantle the system, we continue to run that same race. We're like this. We're like we're in a car race, but we're racing with a beat down Chevy from 1957 when we should be racing with a Porsche. You know what I mean? But
we have a horse and car.
Well, I support those comments, and I'll say two things. In Estonia, there's a gentleman called Linar Vik. Linar Vik has the most unique job title or job description anywhere. His job is every day to find an idea, a concept, or a policy that will drive Estonia forward. That's his job. Mm-hmm. Every day, across the entire government. That's one. Number two, I participated in a conference to redesign the Turks and Caicos Constitution, where I was appointed to the all-party committee at the House of Lords in 2009 as a special envoy from the Office of the Premier. And what we proposed, following what Dr. Curry said and what Ms. Bethel said, and also what Nahaja said, was the permanent secretary. We proposed that they have a budget that at their level, they become the knowledge center. Mm-hmm. They're the knowledge center. And at their level, they can hire experts to aid them in building policy so that they can advise ministers appropriately. They understand the functioning of the government, they understand the capacity of the government, and they understand the intellectual freight of the ideas. So if at that level, and this is important when you have a national university, they should be able to call on scholars. So I'm not in the university Dr. Curry is. They shouldn't call me first. They should call Dr. Curry. Dr. Curry should then say, let me get Ms. Bethel and Morris and all these people and build them in so that look at the amount of institutions that are touched by that and the knowledge transfer that takes place. And this is how you deepen participation and break out of the silos and stretch those ideas and policy options across a broad panoply of the society. Our problem is, and I'm sorry to say this like this, but most of our leaders have never been important for anything before they got into politics. And most of them have never worked in a collegial environment where constant assessment, criticism, and so on is necessary, not just to advance, but to maintain your position. Just to maintain your position. I was giving the example the other day that if you're going to become a professor Dr. Curry, you know this, in Britain or in France or in the United States, Japan, any one of these places, you have to, when you're hired, no one person hires you. A faculty senate engages you. You sit there with a panel of experts and they go at you. You know, can you give an outline of the bibliography in this field and the 5 formative ideas, and can you give the pro and con and give an establishment of some of the, you know, asymmetrical ideas that have operated in this field? You have to answer, right? Can you give the leading papers in this field over the last 25 years and why you find them significant? And can you establish the critical nexus in which they exist? You have to answer. So the permanent secretaries, first of all, they have to be the faculty senate of the government. They have to operate like the faculty senate of the government. And they are the lodestar of all governmental knowledge. But you have to reach outside of them. And our problem in the Caribbean is we have ossified government so much in pride of place that most government positions are just another form of status making. And so the individual is there to establish a status for him or herself. So they need all ideas to appear as if it comes from them. They cannot risk collegiality because they need all the points of good ideas and all the complements and references to apply to them so that they can maintain their place in the system.
Yes, and that's what we started out talking about in the strengths of strong leaders over the years as we talk. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little short break and pay the piper, whoever the person's name, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes or so. So we look forward to you. You've been listening to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles. We have the lovely Rowena Bethel and Nahaja Black, who has just popped off a second. Doctors Curry and Chris Curry and Gilbert Morris, who is back with us again. Hopefully his internet will stay up and keep us. When we come back, he will have the floor to present his topic, and then if Nahaja is back, then she will also have the floor to present her topic. So, Madam Producer, you want to take us to the break?
Sammy's Chicken. There's nothing like it.
Knowles, head coach of 242 Elite Basketball Program. Currently, we're in Orlando, Florida, trying to get our Bahamian youth some exposure, not only to high-level basketball, but also to coaches from prep schools and colleges so that they can get scholarships and go on to further their education and their basketball careers. On top of this, we want our guys to be productive members of society and well-rounded young men. While we're here, we've been doing practices, individual workouts. We've been doing film, scrimmages, versus other schools, programs, semi-pros, and so forth. Also, we've been putting our players into tournaments every weekend so they can play and gain that exposure and get that experience that they need to go on to the next level. We ask that anybody willing to donate, feel free to do so. Any bit helps, anything helps right now to help this go smooth for these guys. This is a great opportunity for them, especially seeing that there hasn't been any basketball in the Bahamas this last year due to COVID. So some of these guys that are seniors, they haven't had a chance to showcase their talents and get those scholarships that they need to further their education. So we ask that you help us out in helping these guys. You can see our teams on social media. You can see us on Facebook at 242 Elite. You can see us on Instagram at 242__Elite. And the same goes for Twitter as well. Again, we appreciate any help that's given. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your support.
So I go shopping at Solomon's Fresh Market, looking for something to satisfy my sweet tooth. When I roll in the frozen aisle, I see this pretty red package. And would you believe it was the new Duff? I scoop all of them in my car to go put them to the test. Steam reheat right at home. Listen, when I bite in that, I say, oh! My grandma got competition.
Welcome back to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles. We're having an awesome conversation here this evening that in trying to help our persons out there in our community understand and to build a vocabulary that is different than what is in the typical discussions in our national narrative to date. My view would be is that once we stretch our minds, then we grow, and then we can do all the different things that we want to achieve, our visions that we have. And so we have this question from the floor from Ms. Lorraine McDonald, which says, why is the discussion about government instead of engaged citizens who implement programs and projects, leadership outside of the system? Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, is there an outside of the system?
Exactly. Actually, I like the question, and it tends to come up in different ways. I often would see on social media, people will say, well, you know, why do you depend on the government to do this? Why don't you just go out there and make your own way and make your own success? And Dr. Gilbert Morris put his finger on it. The government controls so much in our society, even though you think that you have succeeded, a lot of what you depend on relies in one way, shape, or form on some type of government service. And even though persons may measure their success as being outside the government system, I think my retort would be, think how much more successful you could be if, in fact, we had a public administrative machinery that was actually working full throttle. And,
Yes.
and that's, I don't think people understand the level to which government controls things in this country as a primary employer. And you see it often. I have colleagues who are terrified, literally terrified. And I probably, from what I can see on this panel, I'm the only person that ever worked in government proper. Dale, I know you were at BTC. But they are terrified of saying to their minister, you're making... I could take that many ways. Someone described George Bush III as special. In any event, GW.
Right.
In any event, you have people who are able, with wisdom, to see better and to give advice, but they are petrified of doing so because they're so afraid of being victimized or being retaliated against. And to me, that is a little bit disturbing when you have senior people that prefer to sit down and keep their mouths closed and watch the minister walk over a cliff because they're terrified of the reaction if they give advice that appears to be challenging the minister or the prime minister or the government's position. So I think the discussion, for me, the discussion will always be our society to optimum potentially can happen in this country. And
you're breaking up, Rowena. Yeah. So as Nahaja could tell you, coming from a sports environment,
not just the leaders, but the core.
Yeah, coming from a sports environment, then you know that we tend to be very competitive in those environments, and we also tend to know that if you just sit back, you're gonna get eaten. Yeah. And so maybe we are very sports-minded people, but I don't understand why when we get in those environments that we don't assert ourselves.
Yeah, and one of my issues there,
the culture is strong.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of my issues. One of my issues is that when we, I would love for the discussion to be more focused when we talk about leadership from the outside of politics. And I do believe that when something works, when it works to its purpose, then we don't question even its existence. It is just working seamlessly. I always say when a chair doesn't work, when a chair refuses or does not, or finds itself in that moment unable to hold its weight and to do its one purpose of allowing me to sit, then you question, or your faith is changed or challenged, right? All of a sudden you question every chair. After one collapses, you question every chair you sit in after that, right? And that's because the one thing you expected it to do, it's failed to do. And I think that what we found, and where I stand when we talk about leadership and my disappointment, is that I ask the question, why is it that so many Black-led nations are struggling to even know themselves, much less be great? And that challenge to me is disappointing, where how did we end up where we are? Of course, there are, we know that there are international involvements to some extent, but what leads us to stay corrupt in many ways? What leads us to just be moved by titles rather than by actual progress? Where is our dream, our vision? When did we become about just us, our family, our friends, and our lovers? When did we not want to see or compete for a better country? I'm a competitor, man. You don't start a game unless you could win.
But let us remember that in the colonial system, the good governor, the governor that was promoted, was the governor that governed a place where nothing happened.
That's right.
So if nothing happened in the colonial setting, you were a good governor. The system is built for nothing to happen. Can't have a bunch of Chris Currys and Rowena Bethels and Nahaja Blacks and Gilbert Morrises running around talking about ideas disturbing the even equipoise of English rule. And so we adopted that system. And we found we mastered it. And that's why I refer to our countries as cronyocracies. And that is because our politicians, even the ones who go in intending to do good, let's make sure that there are people in government who intend to do good. But what you have is what we call in game theory a multipolar trap. A A multipolar trap happens when you think, I'll speak up in the meeting and say, that this is not a good idea. But then when you do that, you don't get promoted. So the next time the other person says, well, I'm not going to take that risk. So you have a multipolar trap, and then the avoidance of that risk becomes the culture of the system.
Wow.
That becomes the culture of the system because so no one person has to stand up and say, if you challenge me, I will destroy you. You just need one person. Look at what happened when Trump was there and he threatened the CDC. Look at what happened when he threatened Jeff Flake in Arizona. Every senator then simply got in line. And what we found was system fragility depicted the culture, right? Not system purpose, not system mission, not system values, system fragility. System fragility. And we have not cultivated, look, you can't really, across the Caribbean, we built these national systems that cannot metabolize ideas. Why? Because in a crisis, after a crisis like Dorian and a crisis like COVID-19, we've done nothing to change the system.
Nothing.
Nothing. All right? We've done nothing to change the system. And if you look at the countries that are the best performers, Dubai, Qatar, Taiwan, Cayman Islands, they changed their models, they changed their systems, they fixed the future, not the crisis. They attacked the future, not the crisis.
Right.
You have a large number of very talented young Bahamians with no place to go in this country because of this horizontalization.
Right.
Because in every cycle, you have the same old heads sitting there telling young people, this is not the way we do it around here. All right? Criticism in a system like this is terrorism.
Right.
Right?
So Doc,
go on.
No, I was going to just say before, because I want you to get into your presentation as you would say, but it was said just now in terms of, let me just say it this way. At BTC, because Rowena said that, I didn't work for government, I worked for BTC, right? And I said, yeah, we were special. So I don't say it really lightly per se. I mean, I said tongue in cheek, but I mean, it's more to that because I find it as a struggle, as Nahaja is saying, to understand all of these things that Rowena would say and the like, and what you're saying is the struggle within our system of governance on the national level or the bigger level. We didn't have those challenges at BTC. Granted, maybe because we were forced to innovate every 3 months, that everybody had to draw on everybody's ideas to formulate it and teamwork it together and stuff like that to get things done. That these things that you're identifying in this hour or so far on the show, we didn't have those major struggles. Yeah, we had some of those things, but they weren't the dominant things, right? And so I find it difficult to understand why, if we could do it in a quasi-government operation, why we can't do it in a national organization.
Remember, Sir Stafford Sands wrote the Hawksbill Creek Agreement not in government. All right, not in government. Exactly. He was head of the business promotion board or whatever it was.
Yeah, yeah.
So he got that done outside of government.
Okay, so we would like to now invite Dr. Morris to give us a few of his large words on the politics and economics, leadership opportunities. That was the topic I gave him. I wanted him to draw on his knowledge and tell us how strong leadership in those areas or the like could cause us to build a nation because we're only 48 years, and that's just like a toddler, right? And so we want to be able to now take that and build to even greater heights. So the floor is yours,
Well,
Doc.
I think I'm going to riff off of what everyone has been saying.
Okay.
And I think the truth of what has to be said comes out in the discussion. We have a situation where we've had two major events: the Hurricane Dorian and COVID-19. And any objective observer will look at what we have experienced and say, if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit we don't know how to manage crisis. And what we'll also admit is the very things that are necessary in a crisis are necessary to manage small island economies. Small island economies are supposed to operate in crisis mode because we don't control anything. You sit down, you write a budget. But there are all these external forces that are constantly operating against you. If the United States comes and says you can't do that, the OECD blacklists you, all these sorts of things. You can do things to comply, but everything you do to comply raises constitutional questions, raises competitiveness questions, raises questions about how you maximize or prioritize your proximity to the United States, raises questions about how you organize your political governance and your political equation. Let me give you something simple. Pandemics accelerate technology. There have been 258 pandemics in recorded history since the 4th century AD, the Justinian plague, to the current pandemic we have now. Technologies you thought would come into being 30 years from now, they are now dominant, and they are going to become more dominant. But we are an island nation that doesn't control any of the upscaled, upregulated resources. So we have to react, in most cases, to the dominance of those technologies. Small island states then have to behave as if this is a crisis, because if the technology is determined from the outside, it imposes upon you constitutional issues. Let me give you an example. We refer to the four biggest companies, technology companies. They have GDP larger, many times larger than all of CARICOM's GDP. So if we move around the world adopting this one's platform, that one's software, and so on, technology now has come to the place where the range between decisions and the operation of technology has narrowed significantly. And now when you adopt someone's technology, they're able to tell you, no, you can't make that kind of decision. Or you can't make that because the technology requires you to make decisions this way. So we could find ourselves adopting technologies to try and keep up with 21st century developments and to respond to the acceleration of technology. But in adopting those technologies, we lose our capacity to manage this country on a constitutional basis. That is the crisis. But I don't understand how you could be looking at that crisis and not see that as an emergency where every person of talent and every citizen with concern is engaged in a new thinking. I'm part of a group called the Consilience Project. The Consilience Project is concerned with civilizational risks. What are the risks that could eliminate human civilization from the face of the earth? People think the earth is in problems. It's not the earth, it's the world. The earth will be here all the while. The problem, and what we talk about there is in what ways can we reimagine digitized democracies? In what ways can we do that? Estonia is one example, Norway is another example, Singapore is another example, and believe it or not, Dubai is a type of example in terms of exponential technology. And the satisfaction, as Ms. Bethel says, of whether people's lives are different. And if you look at the Emir of Dubai, he's constantly publicly asking this question: are the lives of my people better? I was an observer of the 2008 elections in Singapore. There were 89 seats. The government had 88. They lost 4, just 4. 4 seats, they lost 4. They spent 2 weeks traveling around the country saying, please forgive us. We have failed you. We need to pay attention to your needs. You wouldn't have taken those 4 seats from us, all right, if we had responded to your needs. Which governments of the Bahamas have taken that route to rethinking our democracy and looked at Dorian and said, my God, our response to this crisis was disastrous, and this crisis is likely to repeat itself? Which government has said, look at COVID-19. Our response to this was suboptimal. We need to rethink our democracy. Instead, we're trying to drive, as Ms. Bethel said, this old, or like Dr. Curry said, this old jalopy. And then we put a Sirius XM radio inside and we say it's technologized, but it doesn't align with any of the coordinates of the old machine. And so we can't execute anything. Final point. I argued in March of last year, when the world was uncertain about the vaccines, that we should get every Bahamian physician, microbiologist, epidemiologist, organic chemist, and we should send them to the 5 vaccine development centers around the world, including Brazil and Cuba. All right? If we had done just this thing that would cost us no real money, remember at that time, your leading epidemiologists thought that a vaccine in 1 year was a crazy idea, right? So small nations are supposed to look at this opportunity and say, this is where we can wedge ourselves in. So even if our people were just cleaning Bunsen burners in those research centers, when the new mRNA sequencing had been done, our scientists would have been part of the story. Think of what their reputations would be today if we had just sent them to those centers. Okay, we didn't do that, which means we also weren't on the inside track to get the vaccines we say we now want everyone to take. Now we've begged for the vaccines because we didn't participate at the upper level. But we're asking our people to take vaccines. This is about leadership now. And in spite of you hear statistical analysis about various rare diseases and side effects and so on, but there's been 10, I count 11 today, 11 different rare side effects. At some point, you have to stop saying they're statistically insignificant. And you have to say, let us go and find out what the medical profile was of those people who suffered from those side effects, and let us review our population, all right, for those biological for those medical profiles. And once you've done that diagnostic profiling, you produce reports, because that is doing science. And for a small country, that allows you to speak to the entire world in a moment of crisis where the world needs that knowledge. Secondly, if we had every month monitored all the people who took vaccines, given our high cases of comorbidity, people with underlying conditions, and involved Mercy Corps and involved CARICOM and involved the African Union, the Bahamas could have led, not in denigrating vaccines or conspiracy theories, but in the forensic science involved in analyzing and categorizing the after effects and the side effects of these vaccines, so that we are neither vaccine evangelists nor are we anti-vaxxers. We are a smart nation that has contributed to the bulk of global knowledge on the use of vaccines in this pandemic. We have just something as simple as that would put our scientists on the world stage, where the Bahamas is leading in this sort of thing. We have failed to do these simple things. And if perchance in the future we find out that the absence of longitudinal studies and the absence of clinical trials, that we took these vaccines and they caused damage in our population, we are going to look outside the Bahamas for someone to blame, and we're going to look outside the Bahamas for someone to help us. When in fact, using the existing institutions we have right now, using the existing intellect we have right now, we could set up diagnostic committees that look at our experience with these vaccines, catalog them, run them according to some diagnostic methodology, and then report them to the world and stand proud in the world as a country that's not just sun, sea, and sand, but that we've applied our intellect to a global problem and that we have something to say to the world about it. That is leadership that is available to us. It's inexpensive. It's not complex. It's available to us. It benefits us. It would benefit the world. And yet we have done nothing to embrace it. This is truly devastating in my view. Devastating.
Yeah, thanks, Doc. And I opened up by saying that we have not necessarily a leadership crisis, but we have a deficiency of leaders in positions of leadership, right? And so when you speak just now, it brought that back to the forefront, and it sounds, because you were talking about us being small nations without much influence or much authority, but a lot of influence to do things. But when we look at that in terms of saying that if we don't have the persons in the positions of leadership who has the competence of managing crisis in crisis modes and the like, then we won't get the type of results that we need to get, because we're not going to put outfielder to play second base. So that is something that we might need to change, how we look at that. Nahaja, I saw you scratching your head a little bit while Doc was speaking, so I know you got something to say on this.
Well, one of the things that I can always say when Doc's talking is preach, right? Preach, right? Just let the word come. Because I think all of what he said is that how is the guided approach to us with regards to growth? How can we grow, right? One of the things that always challenges me is how can we set economic policy if there is no vision? Like, what is really the economic policy? The economic policy is not to go into debt. We failed in that. Is the economic policy to increase national wealth, to increase the GDP per capita? Yeah, we failed at that. What is the economic policy of the Bahamas, right? What is our standard? What is our goal, our loftier goal? So when I hear Doc talking, I'm always moved with the fact that, there are people every day, and he mentioned it, the leader of Dubai. How do I make my citizens better? Mm-hmm. And boy, I always exhale, man. The energy it takes to constantly say, what are we doing, right? And wondering. And I have to ask Gilbert, Chris, and Rowena. I have to ask all three of you, what have you seen in the past 10 years? Sorry, Dale, this is my radio host question and answer period, right? I don't What have you seen in the past 10 years that gives you hope, any sort of hope, that somebody knows what they're doing, balancing the scales of the economy and policy? And and the historian, let the historian go first. I'll come to the economist, and then I'll come to the consultant. Sorry, Dale, I all up in your business now. But that's my curiosity. giving way. Chris, what have you seen in the past 10 years?
Well,
I haven't seen anything.
I was on another show and I was talking about a pattern. What we've seen is we've had about 20 years of economic deprivation, starting from 1999 and FTAA and the shrinkage of the offshore banking industry, followed by 9/11, which of course tremendously hurt or impacted our tourism product and industry with security measures. And then you had the global recession. Then you had Francis and Jean in 2004 impacting Grand Bahama. We've had a series of calamities and situations, either avoidable or unavoidable. But the fact of the matter is we've been through 20 years of economic depravity. I say that is to frame my response to you, Nahaja, in a way, because the one good thing that I'm seeing now, speaking as a historian, is the growth of NGOs, non-government organizations that are starting to put a little bit of pressure on the government and providing a think tank of sorts to start to unravel the matrix that we got ourselves in with colonialism and then neo-colonialism. So I think of different organization like ORG. I think about the group that's involved with various environmental groups, whether it be brief. Some of them are tied to the government, but some of them are independent. And it's the NGOs that I think are doing a lot to raise awareness, if anything else, about the situation at hand. But to end my comments, the last thing I want to say is, I think we have a compounded tragedy that Gilbert was talking about. The compounded tragedy is that we had a tragedy with the hurricane and the pandemic, but the bigger tragedy was the fact that we did nothing to innovate. Nothing to change the environment in which we live in, nothing to change how we do business or the economy. So to me, we had a tragedy upon a tragedy, which compounded the original tragedy.
Couldn't said it better.
Yeah.
I'm there with you.
All right. So as we thanks Dr. Morris for giving us that conceptual view and putting context to that view, so that we have a lot to think about as to how we will now choose to move forward, because there's a segment of the show that we were going to touch on that we're not going to touch on today, which has to do with how do we select and elect our leaders, our strong leaders. But so we could wrap up with you, Nahaja, and giving your thoughts and concepts on. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Just one quickly. Nahaja had asked, "What is there that would give you hope in the face of all that has occurred over the last couple decades?" And I say death. Eventually, they'd all die out, and that gives me hope.
Yes, that always works.
Hate to be so blunt.
Yeah.
I like that one though. But they train their successors in a way. God help us.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting you talk about the successors, because we talk about
once they're gone, the successors will be fine.
Yeah, but the three early leaders chose their successions, but we don't seem to want to do it. Everybody keeps saying that succession, you have to take succession, not be given.
But did you see what happened in Cayman? Cayman changed itself during the crisis. Cayman reformed its parliament, reformed its education system, reformed its social welfare system, took in $500 million so that it changed its economy from financial services and tourism to health, financial services, and tourism. I had asked them to consider retirement, health, financial services, and tourism, but that's a different story. But they changed their from a triangle, from a rectangle to a triangle. They and this triangle works together. But here's the interesting thing: Cayman increased its income, its national income from financial services, to overcome its losses from tourism. Right? But here's the funny thing. They did all that. They were very successful. The people were still not satisfied. So you know what they did? McLaughlin's government that handled COVID-19 so well, they won the election. And while they were thus negotiating and parrying and so on, a group of people from the winning party and a group of people from the opposition party joined together, created a third party, and took the government. Because they understood that more needed to be done, despite the excellence. And I rank Cayman as number 4 or 5 in the world in terms of its response to COVID. But Cayman decided, the people of Cayman, the politicians of Cayman decided that they needed a completely new direction. It wasn't enough for the old government to reform the country. You needed new thinking in government completely. And I have argued over and over again, party politics is the worst thing that happened to post-colonial countries. And we should have a series of independents. In Turks and Caicos, you have 5 independents, 10 elected persons in districts. But it's created a culture now where the premier of Turks and Caicos and the senior members of government have to be elected by meaning they have to be elected by the entire country, not just one constituency. Mm-hmm. They have to be voted on by the entire country. That's a constitutional and electoral change that ensures that the premier represents the entire population, not just the constituency.
Right.
Think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very, and if we did, we will have to come back to deal with the question that I said we won't be able to deal with today, which is selecting and electing our leaders, because a lot of what you're saying here is stuff that I've been writing about over the years and stuff, which would be good to tap into your bright minds as to how we could leverage that and take that to an even higher. So Nahaja.
Well, we could.
Go ahead,
No, I was just going to say, well, one thing we could do is look at the One Eleuthera Foundation and see how proper local government could function. And if we repeated that across the country so that people aren't sitting in Parliament making decisions for Grand Bahama, for Abaco, for if Eleuthera, Exoma, and Abaco were released from the strictures of Rawson Square, mm-hmm. they would have a GDP as large as the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talk about it. So Nahaja Black, we want you to touch on this concept in terms of strong leadership, in terms of the mindset of the people, and they're demanding to participate on a daily basis in our governance versus where we grew up, or where I grew up as a young boy, where it was all proxy to the elites to go into the house and make decisions and come back to us 5 years later. Now the people wants this now, and you speak to the people every day. And so I'm sure you have a lot of ideas burning that is topping the top of your head, gold instead of a blonde. Coming out the top, yeah.
I know, right? I know. Well, I just tell you, forgive me, y'all. The synapses aren't firing as they should. It's been a long day. When it comes to the mindset of, I think the individual or the country nationally, it's a great question of the national mindset. What should we be thinking? How should we be thinking? And I think the first thing is that, honestly, we're a country that lacks confidence, a people that lacks confidence, self-confidence, I believe. And that's individually and then nationally. Even the way we are presented, the way our leaders present us to the world, the way we deal with foreign policy. And Dr. Morris would say, Professor Morris would say, well, what foreign policy, right? Rowena Bethel will say the same, what foreign policy? In history, Chris Curry could ask the question, what foreign policy? And that would be my question. The way we look at ourselves and reflect ourselves to the world, the way the world sees us. And that those visuals or those layers are a part of how and why when we act, or when I believe that when the conversation of the mindset of the people, when we get to that point, it has to definitely be a layered one, because how can I, as a voter, how do I even present myself? How do I approach the idea of politics? What am I expecting from politics, from politicians, from policy? Do I follow policy? Do I have policy as a part of my national vernacular? What policies are good for me and my family? What is the function and purpose of policies? How do they benefit myself, my children, my business, my island? Those are the layers of the conversation that I find that when we talk about the mindset, people, the lack of confidence that you matter enough to demand more is an issue. Where we are as a people, I believe, where we present ourselves and we say, listen, they coming around once every 5 years. I can make sure I get everything I could get in these 5 years. Let me see if I could get some crown land. Let me see if I could get this thing and that thing. Because we already have this idea that after that visit, we have no say. We have no power. We are stuck in a loveless relationship, even abusive, for 5 years. We will not get our bills paid. This is the worst sweetheart. He ain't a sweetheart. He is an owner. That is it. We work on the plantation of the politicians, of the elite, of the cronies, of everybody else who got, and the rest of us will suffer the cost. And in 5 years, they will come and lie sweet nothings and tell us sweet lies and nothings. And we know they're lying, but we have to choose. That has created a lot of low self-esteem. That has created and perpetuated this feeling that we don't matter. So the national mindset has to come to a place too, where I believe personally, we have to say to ourselves, I matter. That my child unborn matters. That my neighbor's child matters. That we need better laws to protect our children. That matters. That we need better infrastructure so that my roads, this isn't something that I need to elect you every 5 years to have better roads, for you to tell me about the lamp poles. There needs to be a mindset shift of what is standard. What is just the floor? And then decide that this is base, right? So when we talk about, and as I listen, you listen to your audience, you listen to the people, and as a voter, the fundamental thing to me is that in order for us to even get to the place where we can demand or shift the mindset of the nation, we must individually shift our own mindset of value. And because there is this national thing of who we are, you are here to serve others who have more. You are, those who get out are fortunate, right? Or some sort of specially blessed. That is not the norm. That, when you get sufficient, you can move away from. We don't have this thing where the exceptions are the norm. Like everything, oh man, some people made it to St. Andrews. That's wonderful. Some people made it to Lyford Key. Wow, check them out. Windsor, whoa, this is amazing. But what is this? When does education not have to be paid for it to be elite? And those things to me are when we are going to start seeing the shift, when we demand for the basics, right? And that demand should be R.M. Bailey's educational level should just be as good as Queen's College. That's the demand. The demand is that C.W. Sawyer should be equal to and on par. I'll give you an example. When we had our business a few years ago, a Canadian guy walked into the store and we were talking about education. The Canadian guy says, man, I don't even understand, man. I'm paying for 2 kids to go to St. Andrews. Shout out to St. Andrews for all of you who could afford it. Shout out. I'm paying for 2 kids to go to St. Andrews. But when I was in Canada, man, we didn't pay for nothing. And it's about the same type of education. I was like, what? That's public education? I am in the wrong part of the world, right? Like, what? And that is a standard. But what is our standard? And those are the things that I think fundamentally, before you can even, because see, if I know that I need this type of education, if we can all believe, Dale, Chris, Gilbert, Rowena, if we can all believe that QC's level of education is the standard. Let's just go with that. And I'm calling schools for fun, right?
That's a good school pick.
Yeah, I'm just throwing schools out there for fun, just throwing them out, right? St. John's, right? If we believe that those are the standards, then that changes even the way our politicians, because don't forget, all of our politicians come from us. We begot them. We bring forth these people. They are out of the womb of the culture, right? So they're not all different. They're from us. They may be from different classes, but they're from us. The insecurities, the way we treat each other, they're from us, right? The status quo, the classism, they're of the Bahamian culture and conversation. So we believe that QC is the standard of education, and the politician that shows up out of us will believe that QC is the standard of education. And so when we say that this is what we demand, they would have come up in that saying, it is what it is. That is where we are. That is a goal. That is a mark that we must keep and excel to. How did Finland become known for education? They had a standard. How do other parts of the world? We need to be the people that are saying, you know what? Tourism is great, but we know it's fickle. How did we for decades continue with a fickle industry and then are stunned when things affect the fickle industry? Because we stayed without the standard, just with the job, rather than with the mindset that there was no ownership in this fickle industry, right? So now we have to stop being so insecure as a people and be confident. One of the things I was sharing this morning on Dwight's show, I was on a Crystal Serenity cruise this past week. Great experience. One of the things that I walked away with was that the product is the people, not the beaches, not the excursion, not the pigs. It's the people, right? And I've been saying it a long time. If the people of the Bahamas realize that really we are the experience, then we would be proud to be Bahamian. And if you didn't know what Bahamian was, you would go on an adventure, an expedition to figure out what Bahamian was, so that you could put it on a shelf, so that you could package it, repackage it, brand it, and own it. But see, when we don't know who we are, we don't know what to demand, how to approach our politicians and how they should approach us. And so the mindset of the country and in politics, it has to be that we, the people, say, no, I am the product. I am the product. And we are the product that moves the GDP. When you go and you sit in Brussels and you talk about you're going on a boring tour, the only thing that you're supposed to do when you're thinking of borrowing is figuring out how do we help the product, which are the people. And the people should say, no, don't sell pigs, don't sell beaches, sell me. We should have no tourism ads where only white people who are not Bahamian are in those ads. We should demand different. It should be us. We are the product. We are the product when we talk about business. The face of banking should always be us. And it shouldn't be bears and all of these other, it should be us. And when we get to that place where we say, hey, listen, no, we demand better education because we are the product. You're not going to tell us we're too, you know how upsetting it is to me, guys, when I hear your acting financial secretary come and say, hey, we are too expensive. Or when you hear a former minister of finance say that Bahamians are too expensive. Well, last time I checked, it was expensive to live here. So how can we be cheaper? We can't be cheaper.
Their
so
salaries are expensive.
That's what they're saying. Yeah, that's the only thing. They can't afford us. What a time. And if you look, companies have found every which way to take away tips, found a way to take away all of the little benefits. And you're not getting this insurance. You're not getting that. We're taking away because we're quote unquote too expensive. But when they bring in the expat, they pay them twice, 3 times what they pay Bahamians, give them perks, school fees, cars, etc. They're not too expensive. So we're too expensive. That narrative has to change because, ladies and gentlemen, if our leaders view us as too expensive, that's how we're selling. We can adjust that price. We're not the ones to be adjusted. Increase the educational position of the Bahamian people, and that way we will reach a value that exceeds even the international market. Who is the product? And that is where I am so exhausted, gentlemen, lady, and gents. I'm tired of them all. I'm tired of all of them. I'm tired of all of them because it's always a front. It's always a lie. We believe in Bahamians. It's the people's time. But you never see anything where the money is put right where their mouth is. And as the Bahamian people, the energy used to get your one thing every 5 years is wasted energy. Because we can, in 1 year, stop the whole damn thing by saying no. In 1 year, just shut it all down and say no more. I ain't lifting a finger. I ain't cutting on no light. We can stay here in Rawson. No more. And determine how you're going to dress us. We want you out, right? But everybody say, oh, you might become Haiti. No, we ain't going to become Haiti. We're going to come with better Bahamas. And I think it's now time when we look at this and we think of the mindset of the country, the mindset, and the only way you can get that into our leadership is if we, the people, give birth to these types of people. And that means that in my house and in discussions like this, of course, no more low budget 5-year contracts that only last one day, that one deal, right? Like that one deal. I never been in such unhealthy relationships that last 5 years. This is all my political relationships are unhealthy. Every 5 years, it's just one bad relationship to the next. And I think that we have to realize that we need a divorce as a people. Divorce them all. Go single. Become single. What would happen if we all decided to be politically single? Chris Curry, what y'all used to call it then? What did Strawn say we're supposed to spoil the ballot? I don't believe in that. I can't even fix my...
Yeah, he goes, spoil the ballot. That was that movement with him and Nicolette. That's right. That was the last election.
Yeah, that was a movement of two people. But I just said... That was a two-human movement.
How do we move? Nahaja, you asked at the beginning. Yeah, you asked at the beginning, how do we move forward? It's interesting, actually, because I'm involved in a research and development training center out of Morocco that's looking mostly at Francophone and Lusophone Africa, public administration. And every week we have sort of webinars looking at global issues and the impact on particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And at the end of it, without fail, the speakers end by saying, need the political will. And when you raise the issue at the beginning, people are always pointing out what the problems are. How do we move from this position? Mm-hmm. I hear what you say. I feel, like I've been married in an abusive relationship with this ever-changing creature for the past, several decades as well, politically. And I say to myself, but we're now at this particular stress point in our history. Mm-hmm. What can we do to change it? What are the options? What can be done to change it? To me, a really good litmus test for any of our political leaders, cabinet, the whole lot of them, pull somebody who they really hate as a general in the other party, take that person and their child and say, do you believe that this child and this person deserves the best in this country? And that tell you if they're really or they're for the party. My guess is they'll go for the party because that's what sustains them. We have this team sport business going on in politics. And if you're in the team, your objective is to win, keep everything for yourself and kill the other side. Now, the spectators, you only need them now and again to cheer on for you. That's the electorate. But your objective is to annihilate that other group because you have to self-perpetuate. But that's not the way to build a nation. We can't do all the wonderful things that Gilbert spoke of, that you spoke of, that Chris touched on. We cannot do it. And we have leaders that emerge and say, every single Bahamian deserves to be the best. The Bahamas deserves, just as Gilbert said, the Emir of Dubai, and in fact, all the emirs of the UAE, they said years ago that the UAE was going to emerge as a global player. That was the objective. Has any of our leaders, apart from maybe Pindling now and again hinting at it, have any of them stood up and said, we're going to move the Bahamas front and center, and we're going to solidify a leadership position in the global economy. Are we going to do it? No, they haven't. And so as a result, each iteration of administration comes in and essentially are on the defensive for anything that comes in. But we've never sat down and given a vision that all of the people can follow and say, yes, within the next 20 years, the Bahamas is going to be X, Y, and Z. We realize the struggle that we have to go through. But when you can begin with that and everybody is looking in the same direction as you, and you're prepared to work with everybody to achieve that objective, then I think we're on the right path. But I don't recall any clear vision about where we are in the global space, particularly the super, interdependent global space that we're in today. And consequently, our focus then is on keeping the other team out. That's the objective of government. Keep the other team out. And you do whatever it takes, good and bad, to keep the other team out.
So before
and
we
incidentally,
go to
most countries have corruption. They just finesse it better than us.
Exactly.
Yeah. So before
That's
we go
so
to
true.
the two docs who have look like they ready to jump out their chair. Nahaja, you mentioned about standards, right? And I put it to you that we had a standard at one point in time, and the standard was in a slogan called "It's better in the Bahamas." Now, some people think that that was only geared towards tourists and the outside world.
Yeah.
But my understanding of that slogan was that Penland and his administration used that to build the people, the same people that you're talking about, to help them understand that they are better or can be better than what they were and could be at the level as the other countries and the like. And so that was a standard which they were trying to achieve. Now, whether, as Brother Curry said in his talk, where they went astray, that's another 2 hours conversation by itself. But that standard was there. And the question is, what do we need to do to get back to that? What type of leaders are strong leaders, Dr. Morris? What are the strong leaders to do that?
These are my readings, as you can see. These are my. You see these? These are my readings.
Bahamas. Okay.
Right. And Ian Strawn's book as well. So let me put it up there again, so you can see.
Freedom. What is that? Freedom and resistance.
Yeah.
Socialist Fear of Black.
Right. And so this demonstrates an ingenuity equal to the American Revolution. This demonstrates that there was an ingenuity on this soil equal to the American Revolution. This demonstrates what frustrated that ingenuity.
Wow.
And what I find amazing in Colin Hughes, I was shocked to find was actually a professor of history in Australia. The McKinney, Bancroft, and Hughes, that Hughes was actually a professor of history for 14 years and a member of the American History Association. And he shows something very, very interesting. He has this line where he says, in Britain, a duchess would not kiss a butcher for a vote. But in the Bahamas, the elites can be seen carrying the blacks on their backs to get them to vote. So he's talking about a situation where blacks were voting, but they had to be brought in from the family islands. They couldn't swim. So the elites in Nassau would go down to the water, put the blacks on their back, and walk them in the shallow, set them on the sand so they could go and vote. And when they came back, gave them their little emolument of some flour, sugar, rice, or whatever it was, and then off they went again. But here's the main point. There are 7 colonial dispatches covered in that book. And the theme of the colonial dispatches is somehow the elites, the oligarchs, convince the majority of the Bahamians that the country does not belong to them. That the ordinary Bahamian doesn't have the psychology of a citizen. The ordinary Bahamian walks around with the psychology of an irritant, a useful tool every 5 years.
That's it.
That disappears into the landscape after that. And everything that we've done, I listened to Dr. Curry give a beautiful lecture at University of the Bahamas. I heard him on a video on social media talking about the oligarchs and how they function. I listened to my beautiful sisters talk about their experience, and Rowena Bethel talk about her experience in government. The ordinary Bahamian sucks his or her teeth and says, well, you know, child, that's the government. You can't do nothing but them. You know, the government owns these things. You know, that's the government. So the sale of BTC was a species of terrorism on the Bahamian people and their finances and their national security. But the average Bahamian throws up their hand and says, you know, what can we do about that? We can't do nothing but that. Having a wealthy man own a post office at a time, the wealthiest man in the Bahamas ostensibly owned the post office under a 19th century model when we are in the 21st century digitized. And so we won't have the resources to reform to the 21st century notion of mail and electronic signatures and these sorts of things. We are basically imprisoning the country in the interests of these oligarchs because the ordinary Bahamian does not know how to act as a check and balance because he does not believe that the country belongs to him. Oh, he says he's proud. Says he's proud. He attacks his Haitian brother and his Jamaican brother and, you know, all these sorts of things. And he attacks all this, but the Swiss fellow is riding around on a bicycle making $400,000, $600,000, $800,000 while he's running a quasi plantation full of brilliant Bahamian women with 5 degrees, all right, who are never going to get to the top of that organization. But we don't know how to assert ourselves on the landscape. Final point. When you see this sort of thing and you didn't ratify your constitution, you never decided on what is the originating ethic of the Bahamas. If we had ratified our constitution, perhaps we would have had parity that now where people argue about between Article 7 and Article 12 of the Constitution on citizenship rights. If we'd had parity, maybe Article 70 would be more clear about whether or not the Prime Minister had personal dominion over the Boundaries Commission. If we had ratified our Constitution, perhaps ministerial discretion wouldn't be so broad as to undermine almost every piece of legislation that seeks to hold them accountable. And so you have a country here where we've inherited a plantation system of governance and economy that has metastasized in the hands of a small group of people, as Dr. Curry said previously in a number of interviews which he's given. And the large majority of people on the outside are just happy not to be run over. And if you look at the Immovable Properties Act, 1993, Dr. Peter Blair wrote a paper that shows that for 52 years, wages and land prices moved in tandem with each other. moved in tandem with each other. And once the Immovable Properties Act was repealed, wages and land prices separated from each other, and Bahamians became rentees in their own country, rentees. And the average Bahamian can afford nothing in this country in the way of land. So one essential